Book Talk series. Today's talk is going to be discussing Professor Amita Baviskar's book, Uncivil Society, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi. Can all the participants please mute their mics? There's some background noise. Thank you. I am Shahana Chattaraj. I am the Director of Research at WRI India. And WRI is a research and implementation organization that works at the intersection of environment and development. And a lot of the work that we do focuses on urban planning and how to make it more ecologically sustainable, inclusive, and equitable. So today's book is very relevant to the work we do and how we think about these issues. So today we have two very distinguished scholars who will be discussing Uncivil City. We have Professor Amita Baviskar from Ashoka University and Dr. Madhu Verma, WRI's chief economist. I am now going to briefly introduce our two speakers. And then I'll hand it over to Professor Baviskar, who will talk a little bit about her book. And then we will, for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion between her and Dr. Verma. And both of them approach urban ecology in different ways. So Dr. Baviskar is an environmental sociologist and Madhu Verma is an environmental economist. So I think we'll have a very interesting discussion about the book. After that, after a discussion between the two of them, we will open it up to questions, question answers from the audience for about 15 minutes. In the interest of time, please type your answers in the chat box, and that way I can group together some of the common questions and ask them. I don't think we'll have time to let people ask them individually. So this book is something that some of you may have read it, but I think it's something that everyone from Delhi should read. If you're from Delhi like I am, it really evokes, it spans a long time frame from pre-liberalization 90s on to the present day, and it really evokes changing eras, times, geographies, and also Delhi's rather unique society and culture, which is uncivil definitely, but there are moments of grace. And this is a very well-written and enjoyable read for an academic book. And in this book, Dr. Baviskar delves quite deeply into a series of state actions, places, and events, which include the master planning process, the eviction of polluting industries, the Commonwealth Games, the Yamuna floods, and the development of the floodplain, to make a convincing argument that environmental discourses and state actions on the environment have tended to be partial, as she says, partial, particularistic, and often have had a perverse relationship to questions of ecology, justice, and equity. So the blame and the costs have disproportionately fallen on the city's poor in many of these instances. And there have been tremendous losses in terms of livelihoods, in terms of natural resources, in times of places and cultures. Yet the environmental and developmental benefits of these actions have often not materialized. Let me briefly introduce, give you Dr. Baviskar and Madhu's introductions. Amita Baviskar is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. Her research addresses the cultural politics of environment and development in rural and urban India. Currently, she's working on food and changing agrarian environments in central India and studying the social experience of air pollution and heat in Delhi. Dr. Baviskar received a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University. Her first book, In the Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts Over Development in the Narmada Valley, explores the themes of resource rights, popular resistance, and discourses of environmentalism. Her recent publications include edited books Elite and Everyman, The Cultural Politics of the Indian Middle Classes, and First Garden of the Republic, Nature on the President's Estate, and the monograph we're discussing today. Dr. Baviskar's contributions to environmental sociology in India and to the study of social movements have received peer recognition. She was awarded the 2005 Malcolm Ardisacea Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies, the 2008 VKRV Rao Prize for Social Science Research, and the 2010 Infosys Prize for Social Sciences. And Dr. Verma is the chief economist of WRI India, is an undergraduate in biological sciences, MPhil in economics with specialization in regional planning and economic growth. And she holds a PhD from Bhopal University in industrial economics. She is a Fulbright Nehru Environmental Leadership Fellow, a Leadership in Environment and Development Fellow, has been a visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an INSEE Fellow, that's the Indian National Society for Ecological Economics. And she's a board member at the International Society for Ecological Economics. She's been a team member, lead, and contributing author in several international reports, like the UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity Reports, and the Global Biodiversity Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Thank you again for joining us. I'm now going to hand over to to Professor Baviskar. Amita, if you want to share the screen, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, just go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shahana, for that generous introduction. Thank you, World Resources Institute, for inviting me to this book conversation and to be part of this series. Thank you also, Madhu Verma, for the discussion that I'm very much looking forward to. So, some of you know Delhi, some of you know this book, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I came to write it, just a brief framing to give you a sense of the kinds of issues I take up in the book and the kinds of concerns that drove me to this particular way of looking at cities and at the urban environment. I should begin by saying that the book is very, very local in some ways. As Shahana said, it's about Delhi. And Delhi is there in almost everything that I talk about. But I think that even if you are more concerned about other cities or are more familiar with other cities, much of what is in this book will not surprise you, but you will find that there are many resemblances. And I hope, therefore, we can talk not only about the specificities of Delhi, but in a more general way about what it means to have civil cities, to think about the question of equity, and to think about ecological sustainability from the point of view of a shared future, shared spaces through the metaphor of the commons. So let me begin by talking about shared spaces. Let me begin by sharing my screen with you. And I have pictures that I just want to kind of go through as a kind of backdrop to my remarks, just to give you a visual sense of the place. So what got me started on writing this book was an incident that happened in 1995, quite a while back now, but also in the winter though, on in fact 30th January 1995. And that was when, as Delhi was waking up to another misty winter's day, in the well-to-do neighborhood of Ashok Vihar, early morning risers were emerging from their warm homes for walks. They were bundled in woolen jackets and scarves and caps to keep out the chill. And some of them had pet dogs training at the leash. And as one of these gentlemen walked into the neighborhood park, the only open area in the locality, he saw this young man, thin, poorly clad, walking away with an empty bottle in his hands. And this outraged gentleman morning walker, so much so that he ran, he grabbed hold of the man, he called out to his neighbors. Someone phoned the police. And within minutes, a group of angry house owners and two police constables descended on the young man and they beat him to death. So there was an investigation into this death by the People's Union for Civil Liberties. And their report told me that that young man who was killed was an 18-year-old. His name was Dilip, and he'd come to Delhi to watch the Republic Day parade in the capital. And he was staying with his uncle in a jhuggi or a shack along the railway tracks on the edge of Ashok Vihar. His uncle worked as a laborer in an industrial estate nearby, but like all planned industrial estates in Delhi, this one too had no provision for workers' housing. So this jhuggi cluster, these shanty houses, they had more than 10,000 households, but only three public toilets. So you can imagine that each public toilet had eight latrines. So in effect, each latrine had to be shared between more than 2,000 people every single day, which of course was impossible. So most residents then began using this large open space close to where they lived, um, under cover of dark, as a place to defecate. And their use of the so-called park, just open space, for this purpose of defecation, brought them up against the more affluent residents of Ashok Vihar. And these affluent residents had paid to have a wall constructed between the unsightly Jhuggi Basti as well as their more affluent homes. But this wall was soon broken, not only by people looking for a place to defecate, but also because of the traffic of domestic workers who lived in the Jhuggi Basti but walked across the railway tracks every day to cook and clean the homes and cars of the rich, to wash their clothes and mind their children. So Dilip's death was thus the culmination of a long standing battle over a contested space that to one set of people embodied their sense of gracious urban living, a park as a place of trees and grass devoted to leisure and recreation and doggy walks, and that to another set of residents was the only available space that could be used as a toilet. And if Dilip had known about this history of simmering conflict, it's quite likely that he would have been more alert and more wary. He might have run away when challenged, but because he didn't know, he died. So, this incident made a huge impression on my mind at that time because until then, I had actually conducted research in rural settings, even though I lived in Delhi and taught at Delhi University. Um, and the particular rural setting in which I worked was the Narmada Valley, which will, as many of you know, has been the site of struggles over displacement due to large dams, as well as forestry projects, for since the 1980s, and they have this is an area which is also witnessed um, more gradual processes of environmental degradation and impoverishment related often to insecure land tenure. People didn't own the lands that they cultivated. Most of the land was owned by the forest department. So in this area, I'd come across only too often the way in which the government used the forest department, the police, other state agencies, um, their instruments in order to systematically, in a way, crush the aspirations of poor people. This was, before the Panchayati Raj came into force in the ways in which it had subsequently. I'm talking here about the early 1990s onwards. And there was it was very hard given the social distance between the primarily Adivasi communities or scheduled tribe communities that lived here and an upper caste institutional establishment, the bureaucracy, all the officials, etc. It was very hard for Adivasis to manage to just put together basic subsistence in a way that was also, dignified and honorable. And now, what I was getting to see in Delhi was, in some ways, a very similar contestation over space. If in the Narmada Valley, that contestation had been over agricultural fields, over forests, over the river itself, landscapes that were going to be taken away and submerged by large dams. In the case of Delhi, I was looking at the way in which environmental struggles took on a particular kind of pattern where, in the name of cleaning up the city, of environmental good in through removing air pollution, for instance, um, state actions and initiatives ended up again penalizing a working class, largely poor population in the city. And at that time in Delhi, there were two very, very powerful attempts to remake the city's landscape. And the first was that there were a series of court orders from the Supreme Court of India that started the closure of all polluting and non-conforming industries in the city. Non-conforming means that they failed to meet the provisions of the designations of the land use plan in terms of which activity could happen where. So the Supreme Court said that all polluting and non-conforming industries should be shut down. Um, Throwing out of work an estimated 2 million people employed in and around 98,000 industrial units. And at roughly the same time, the Delhi High Court ordered the removal and relocation of all squatter settlements, Juggi squatter settlements on public lands, an order that demolished the homes of more than 3 million people. So at that time, Delhi had a population of about 3 million, around 12 million people. So you can imagine the havoc that these court orders created, both in terms of taking away people's employment and in taking away the homes in which they lived. So interestingly, both these processes were set in motion by the filing of public interest litigation by environmentalists and consumer rights groups. So, as I tracked these kinds of changes happening in Delhi, I came to realize that what these environmentalists represented was a particular form of environmental thinking and acting, something that I then began to call bourgeois environmentalism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I just wanted to say that in bourgeois imaginations of what environmental concerns matter, their focus is around aesthetics, urban order, their own safety and health and leisure. And that these considerations have come to actually shape how cities are run and how they're managed. And as I tried to make sense of these changes that were set in motion through these court orders, um, I found that there was a Delhi that I actually knew nothing about. Because even though I live in North Delhi and Ashok Vihar is very close to where I live, I'd never actually gone into a Juggi Basti or into an industrial area. So geographical proximity didn't actually translate into social familiarity. Because in my mental map of Delhi, such places had simply been invisible. It was only when I put aside my taken for granted sense of the city and my privilege as a well-off resident, that I realized just how segregated this city was. And when I then began to look more closely into the history of urban planning, the kind of master plans that Shahana mentioned, I discovered that while this spatial configuration was a product of deliberate design, and the design was guided by benevolent intent, these are people who wanted to make cities better. They had inherent biases that led to perverse outcomes. And so it was in these Juggi bastis that I came to realize, um, when I went into their filthy toilets or looked at their open drains, I came to realize that spatial segregation also created a kind of apartheid of the imagination. That even though the majority of Delhi's citizens actually live in such settlements, well off sections of the urban population simply didn't see or care about them. Despite the dense fabric of daily economic transactions that bring us into contact with domestic workers, vendors, security guards, courier delivery people, sales assistants, and restaurant staff, Delhi's upper classes remained socially incurious and spatially oblivious to where and how the working classes lived. So, unless, of course, they have to be next to a Juggi Basti and it happened to, smell bad and look bad and they had to deal with it and it obtruded on their sense of urban order, then we find upper class resident welfare associations or other groups moving the courts and petitioning for the summary eviction of such working class settlements. And these kinds of actions end up further intensifying the continuing contradictions between a shared economy of work, because where would we the upper classes be without our domestic workers, um, or our vendors and so on. And so there's a shared economy of work, but it exists alongside a hugely segregated ecology of shelter. So this is what got me going. And just one final paragraph that kind of gives you a sense of the argument of the book. And cities have overtaken the countryside as the place where most people around the world live. And so the question of their ecological capacity to sustain decent lives, lives worth living, has become all the more critical. Yet, when we look at the kinds of debates and actions that have happened around city planning and governance, and we actually carefully observe urban environmental campaigns in terms of what they achieve on the ground, we see that the end results have very little to do with either ecology or with social justice. And I argue in the book that this is to do with what we identify as an environmental issue. So, housing is not thought of as an environmental issue, whereas for most people, that's what the environment is. It's their habitat. It's what they live in, and which allows them to live comfortably and with dignity. But housing is not treated as an environmental issue, but green areas are. Um, Air pollution is, but in very specific ways. Never in terms of the occupational safety of those who are vulnerable and who have to breathe in dirty air. But the problem of who's creating dirty air in the sense of private motor vehicle emissions is never squarely faced. You find you say the farmers who are burning stubble in the rural areas around Delhi are responsible for air pollution, but the fact that such a large significant part of it comes from private motor vehicles, apart from the odd even scheme, we've had nothing, no significant measure to try and control that. So what is an environmental issue? Who is authorized to speak for and on behalf of the environment? And third, which modes of action count as legitimate? So it's legitimate for people who have the resources to go to the courts and appeal to judges who are part of the same, sort of social, economic habitus as themselves, for court orders that take away the rights to work or the rights to shelter of working class people. But it's not all right for poor people to whom no legal affordable housing is offered in the city to squat on public lands that were anyway acquired from farmers at very low prices. So which mode of action is legitimate and which is not? How do you evict somebody on environmental grounds where they're not even um, they might be living on the Yamuna floodplain, but what's polluting the river is the sewage that's untreated that comes from the well-to-do and so-called developed colonies and neighborhoods of Delhi. So one can see the way in which these kinds of debates and these processes show that the power to define and deal with an issue as an environmental problem is unequally distributed. Social location and cultural capital shape interpretive frameworks and capacities to act, and that it's economic and political inequality that has led to selective and superficial framings of environmental issues. So I go on to say that the urban environment also poses a peculiar perceptual problem because unlike in rural areas where you can look at land or forests or water and say this is nature and this is what we need to do to protect it. Here's biodiversity. In the urban context, ecology, the workings of climate and nature and soil and materials and biological processes are hard to identify and understand because they are predominantly artifacts which become incorporated into the built environment. So, people have suggested we think of urban metabolic processes as the transformation of energies and therefore get a different idea of nature. But that's not the idea of nature that commonsensical understandings are based on. Um, and finally, I make the argument that the general thrust of managing urban environments has been towards trying to secure social and spatial order. It's all about managing places with a certain kind of modernist aesthetic in mind, an aesthetic which also goes along with the kind of power that is wielded by dominant classes. And this logic of social and spatial order continues to dictate environmental politics in the city. And in the book, I show the very many ways in which this quest for order actually doesn't result in either greater ecological sustainability or social justice. In fact, quite the contrary. And so in the book, I trace these kinds of arguments through looking at people's homes and workplaces, by looking at the river Yamuna's floodplain and at the city's large green area, the ridge. I look at streets as an embodied public sphere. And then I also look at the ways in which extraordinary events like the Commonwealth Games end up creating new crises as well as opportunities in order to reshape the city. Let me stop there. And I have a feeling I've already gone on too long. So
No, that's
sorry
just
about that.
no, no worries. That's just perfect. But I will quickly hand over now to Madhu so that you can have this. Madhu, do you want to put your video on?
Yeah, it's on, I think.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you, Shahana, and thank you, Amita, for a wonderful presentation. And it's a pleasure, it's a delight reading your book. It reads like a novel. And once you start, you don't feel like putting it back. You have to finish till the end, And it took me to the journey of my own visit to Delhi for the last so many years. And I could see how it evolved over the time period and the area in which you lived, you studied, and you did your work in IG. I happen to have been visiting that area for last, almost 30 years. So it's good to also get an understanding about how the fabric of the city has changed over time and various factors which cause this kind of, strong change in the entire fabric. And Delhi, which used to be 30 years ago, is totally different now. And very nicely, you've touched upon various, points and talked about how things have changed. What are the watershed events which happened in Delhi? Who talks on behalf of whom? Who talks about environmentalism? The whole issue of displacement of people because of the relocation of industries. All such issues you've brought in very beautifully in your book. I'm very amused to see, use of a lot of C, capital letter C, kind of words in your entire, presentation of book. Being an environmentalist myself, we talk a lot about various P's in the system, the process, products, people, various R's in the system. We talk about reuse, recycle, reduce, recharge, restore, rehabilitate, refurbish, like that. And the ecological sector, we talk a lot about, ecological, economic, efficient, equitable. But I'm so amused to see you talk a lot about, starting with, of course, the scenario of Delhi, which people feel very amused about, and everywhere in India. In fact, you found cows, you found cycle rickshaws on the roads, you find cars on the roads, and you also talk a lot about connecting these sort of entities with civility. You talk about citizenship and civility a lot in the entire discussion. And ultimately, you talk about who claims on the common lands and why should they be available for various purposes. You talk about closure of small industries, in various regions of Delhi, shifting them to so-called conforming area, another C that you talk about in your book. And of course, this whole cities discussion, we talk about smart cities and what exactly is smart, for whom they are trying to be smart, and whether they are really providing what we need. And you also mentioned in your discussion about the corporate consultants which are there to actually evolve the city without involving people for whom the entire design is being actually made. And ultimately, of course, the core criteria that people should consider while developing the entire city. What I would also like you to talk about and also throw a light upon other C's in the system, which are actually congestion, crime, and cost, which the entire developmental process has led to. So if you can just throw a bit light upon these factors as well, and then I'll connect with the more environmental factors in the next question. Over to you, Amita.
Wow, thank you, Madhu. I hadn't thought about my work in quite that way. But now that you pointed out all of these C's, I am very much struck by how true that is. So yeah, certainly one chapter is called Cows, Cars, and Cycle Rickshaws, where I get to actually vent a lot of steam around the issue of cars, which I don't like, cows, which I find curious, and a curious anomaly in the city, in the idea of the modern city, and the ways in which cycle rickshaws have managed to negotiate a place for themselves in the city, even though they've been looked down upon, and even though there have been court orders to try and remove them. The other C's that you talked about are, of course, civility. And at some point, I'd like to talk more about why I use that word uncivil in the title of the city. Because, to my mind, the issue of how we live in a city is about the encounter with others different from oneself, an encounter that should not be marked by fear, suspicion, hostility, but perhaps by a sense of curiosity, the sense of excitement, that you're living with somebody who's from a completely different community, has totally different food, how interesting, speaks a different language, that there are rich opportunities here to learn from others different from oneself, to broaden one's mind, to become more tolerant. And given the tenor of politics in our country, especially in the last 10 odd years, I would say that this sense of the importance of civility has really gradually grown upon me. And I'm reminded of the way in which cities were imagined by people like Baba Sahib Ambedkar, but by a whole host of other, modernist scholars in the West as well, as places where you could leave behind the stultifying social hierarchies of the village, that where everybody knew what caste you belonged to, where you were always reminded of what your place was in the social hierarchy. The city was meant to be a liberatory space where nobody could tell who you were by your caste. You could sit at a tea stall and drink tea next to somebody else. Neither of you knows about the other person's caste, and even more beautiful, you don't care. So I think that idea of civility as a relationship to be cultivated between citizens, and perhaps on not a relationship to which for which one can look to the state for action, that has really kind of become very important in the way in which I'm thinking about the project of equality in the city, because far too often our emphasis in looking at what's wrong with cities in terms of governance and planning has throughout been to say this is what governments should do. These are our rights as citizens, and therefore we seek recognition for vendors, or I'm sorry, recognition for people who've squatted on public lands and so on. But more and more, I think that that fight for for entitlements as citizens needs to be accompanied by the fight for greater civility in the project of creating common spaces, common modes of interacting. So that's kind of a long way of getting to the C's that you actually did talk about. But I wanted to add a couple of C's to the ones you mentioned. One is commercialization, especially the commodification of land, which to my mind is a really big process that is making our cities much more privatized and is taking away the urban commons, which could be streets, open fields. In the case of Delhi, the Yamuna, the Yamuna floodplain, places like the Ridge. What we see is the gradual shrinking of these urban commons and their commodification, so that they become available for real estate development, for capital intensive projects of um, greater monetary value. So another big C word in the book is capitalism. But all of this is the backdrop against which one can look at the questions that you raised, Madhu, in terms of congestion, crime, and I guess cost. I'd interpret cost as value. What is the value of things? How has the value of things shifted? The Yamuna floodplain once accommodated these large numbers of people who lived there, who built communities for themselves, by leveling the land, by putting in that backbreaking work of first building a juggi, then gradually, brick and mortar walls, putting in a concrete slab to make a roof. Um, all the sorts of things that people put into creating homes and habitats for themselves um, get swept aside when that land is deemed to have better value. And I think since economic liberalization began in the 1990s, the notion that the cost of things or the value of things should only be measured in terms of what it can fetch in the market, how much money you can make. I mean, that's become the dominant metric. And, of course, that's a measure which means poor people never get a look in because they don't, their practices, the fact that they're providing services to the entire city, the fact that life for everyone would grind to a halt if people living in bastis didn't, show up for work. All of these kinds of considerations get left out when the value on space is only measured in terms of money that can be made off of it. I think crime is a interesting question, and to my mind, I'm always struck by the this is something I've said before, but I'm always struck by the extent to which there's actually far less crime in Indian cities than perhaps exists in other places where there are similar levels of social and economic inequality. So, look at the levels to which upper class people living in, say, Mexico City or in Johannesburg have to, constantly guard against being physically attacked, or, their cars carjacked, or there's a whole huge security infrastructure that is a sign of the kind of um, crime that exists. In India, of course, we have gated communities, we have security, private security everywhere. But yet, by and large, that atmosphere of fear of being under attack, which is a major part of the anxieties that elites in other cities in the global south have, um, doesn't exist maybe in a lot of Asia or South Asia, but certainly in India, that's not the case. So I look at this relative absence of crime as a kind of cultural puzzle that, in fact, people have so much to be angry about. People have so much to resent. Why is it that we don't see as much expression of it as um, as there should be? But I think if we expand the notion of crime to include all sorts of other kinds of violence, then I think we will see there a reflection of the fact that so many people are poor, disenfranchised. They see job opportunities drying up just when their aspirations have opened up. So I think there are questions there about masculinity and about how to be a man if you're a young man with no prospects. But anyway, I think I've gone on too long, so let me
You
stop there.
rightly pointed out, Thank you, Amita. We rightly pointed out about the valuation part of the urban areas and the cities, understanding what they exactly provide, not always measuring them in terms of the money value, but also non-monetary measures are also there, the cognitive benefits in terms of landscape value. So all these things should be also embedded in the system. And also people are taking an initiative, making an effort to make the city, so-called environmentally friendly, make the city green, make the city, blue rather, and create spaces where you can easily breathe. See, COVID-19 has given lots of, definitely some benefits out of it. Also, we have visualized, we have seen in terms of clear skies, in terms of brightness which is available around, good quality air, chirping of birds around. Why can't we have similar kind of scenario always in these cities? Unless until whether one likes it or not, you put a value on these services, these benefits that we get from so-called green spaces, the blue spaces in the city, and having more of horizontal expansion than vertical expansion. Unless that measure is done, is taken into consideration, we cannot move in a way that we incorporate environmental factors into the planning process. Just a quickly example of the city of Portland, which is one of the most green cities in the world. They have a system. They have a very interesting. I happen to have done my Fulbright fellowship over there, and I could see kind of organizations which exist. It's not just a matter of only policy intervention. You must have institutional system to actually affect the policy and create market mechanisms definitely to respond to these kinds of scarcities and abundance in the system of environmental factors. There's a Bureau of Environmental Services in Portland State, where all your efforts to green the city, to make the city blue, make the city more environmentally friendly, are being rewarded. And we have a system called as the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity for cities also, being applied across the globe in many cities, and they were able to actually influence entire planning and urban design based upon those outcomes. The mapping is being done, and when you find that you have conserved habitats to be taken into consideration while you do planning, you don't disturb them. So how do you see the scope of involving such factors, such values in the environmental planning and design system in India? And what kind of efforts need to be made to sensitize so-called planners, so-called people who are at the helm of affairs to effect these kind of initiatives on ground?
The fact that cities like Portland have managed to accommodate a variety of land uses which seem to be more ecologically sustainable is, of course, terrific. But one has to then think of, well, this is such a pleasant space, but it's an affluent space. So where exactly is their ecological footprint? And when I look at, nice cities in the West or anywhere else, um, this is what I see as part of, the kind of invisibilization I talked about earlier. That living in Delhi, I wasn't aware of the areas right next to where I lived, which were where the dirty work of production happened, which is where the work of reproduction of the working class happened. So, in the same way, I think one has to ask oneself that all the goods and services that are consumed by the citizens of Portland, where are they coming from? A lot of cities in the West have managed to clean up their act because they've got China to do their dirty manufacturing work for them. If one looks at resource flows, and this is where the idea of metabolism, urban metabolism, is so useful, one can actually trace the way in which the creation of particular enclaves of, you know, the nice cities we would all like to live in, with great clean air, with good public transport, with no heaps of garbage around, etc. Those are the cities we want. But then, what are the hidden costs of those cities on landscapes elsewhere? So one has to actually track costs, ecological costs and social costs, in terms of what is hidden out of view, as much as appreciating what is there. And here I'll say that I think if one looks at the role of markets, often they are in, and let's carry on with the Portland example. I mean, in the Portland example, one might ask, well, why don't people here live in slums like they do in India? Why is it that it has fewer, say, homeless people than Washington, D.C.? What is it that Portland is doing differently? And that then leads us to a whole set of issues around, say, the availability of social housing, whether affordable housing is there for poor people, the basic elements of a welfare state in terms of decent schools, medical care, etc. Do they exist or don't? Because we must remember that these are not things which are constructed by good markets. In India, for instance, we can see the kind of perversities that markets create. That anybody who is not super well off is priced out of the real estate market in most cities in India. And if a young white collar working professional can't hope to enter the property market without going into some, without taking a loan that's going to be paid off in 20 years. And even that loan will just allow them to, invest in a flat somewhere in some distant suburb. What is the chance that poor people in the city, people who are barely making enough to make ends meet, are going to be able to afford anything like a decent place to live? Let's think about the welfare state as was revealed to us by the lockdown. How is it that so many workers in cities didn't have that that little cushion of savings that they could afford to stay on in the city for long enough till the lockdown eased up? Why is it that they had to ask their relatives at home in villages to send them money so that they could travel back home? So we're talking about a welfare state which is non-existent for industrial workers, for a huge part of our working population that works in all kinds of informal occupations. So markets aren't working for these people.
Exactly, exactly.
And therefore, one can't expect that in city planning, their priorities and their interests are going to be recognized unless there's a kind of concerted effort, political effort to do so.
Yeah, thank you, Amita. Very, very interesting sort of discussion and lots of insights. Otherwise, we just pass by many issues, pass by, populations don't get to understand the reality, and that your book actually provides a good reality check on various issues. I think we also have lots of questions in the question box, and I'll request Shahana to now take over and put those questions in front. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhu and Amita, for a very interesting discussion. I think, Amita, there's so many questions here that have been raised that are not merely academic, but they're still sort of complex concepts that we need to work through, I think, as a society, if we are really going to be able to address how our cities can actually, be sustainable and offer the sort of future and opportunities that one expects from urbanization as a process to all citizens, not just to a narrow elite. And I think some of these, the really important questions, one is really planning is in the public interest, but what is the public interest here? And how do we define it? I think another question that I still am not, completely clear about is how do we understand urban ecology? What are the boundaries of the ecosystem? When Madhu talked about Portland, which I think is doing very well, but at the same time, if we think of it as part of a larger global system, and the fact that many of the problematic issues have been pushed elsewhere and outside, that is something that we need to concern ourselves with. And my question is, I'm going to take my privilege as a moderator to ask one question before I move on. We're running a little late, but I think we can go on till 8 o'clock because we have a few other good questions as well. So I'm going to continue with the theme of C and bring in two more Cs. One is climate change, the elephant in the room, and the other one is the issue of civicness. So I have, I kind of work on local governance and planning myself, and seeing a lot of the harmful effects it's done, and the kind of rigidity and inadequacy and perversity of our planning institutions, particularly the master plan. Till now, I've had a very, sort of do no harm approach. And a lot of the environmental movements that are more progressive are sort of counter movements, which are again around do no harm. But my question to you is that enough in the context of climate change and the need for us to really, kind of undertake sort of large-scale coordinated state actions to address this? And is that enough? And if it's not, if we need to actually have a planning system that works, what would it look like? And a related question is a notion that's becoming quite popular now, particularly in a lot of European discourses, is the issue of civicness. So that's one where, it's related to civility, but the idea is it kind of reframes this, the relationship between the state and society around these kind of common shared responsibilities and active citizenship and things. And is that something that makes sense for us? So I'm just coming from Kerala, and I can kind of see the emergence of that in Kerala because we have strong local institutions. I'm not sure that I can see that, say, in a place like Delhi. So if you could just answer these questions, and then I'll move on to the audience ones. Thank you.
Thanks for those questions, Shahana. I mean, I think that what you said finally about Kerala and what's happening with, planning and with civicness there, actually sort of addresses the larger question here, which is that at the end of the day, planning in practice is a form of political negotiation. You can have the best plan in the world, but what it looks like on the ground is going to be shaped by all these, contending social groups and so on. And you may well know, what's the right thing to be done. And yet you find that even those institutions which are supposed to do the right thing, in fact, let you down. I mean, just think about the Central Vista issue at the moment. The number of violations that have happened, both at the level of procedure, but also in the sense of basic democratic discussion, participation. Um, if there's something which needs to be discussed, surely it is what, our entire sort of symbolic landscape about democracy should look like. But we find that because of the given configuration of power at this time, even the courts are not willing to stand up and speak out against it. So I think we have to therefore, uh, you know, end that separation between planning and practice. Let us begin planning with the idea of knowing and understanding what practice looks like. Let's keep in mind that municipal officials have these kinds of interests, this way of looking at things. They don't give a damn about the environment, they're never going to. So, if we know that in our plans, then the exercise of planning becomes one of, well, let's think of where the potential lies in the system. What are the chinks in this bureaucratic armor? What are the points at which different kinds of people can get to intervene, can get to ally with other kinds of people and so on. And here I think that some of the responses to climate change are slowly coming in. So when I see, for instance, after the big floods in Chennai, and elsewhere, in before that in Mumbai, there is a gradual sense that certain kinds of wetlands need to be maintained, and not just sort of in the do no harm way that you talked about, Shana, but also in the sense of needing to be restored and reclaimed. Now, we see that happening in, say, cities like Bangalore, that citizens groups, environmental groups come together, they put pressure on the municipality, and with their tacit support, end up cleaning up a particular area. But unfortunately, that process of cleaning up, while it is indeed, ecologically desirable, um, is something which often ends up gentrifying the area. So if there happen to be other users of the area, Karen Coelho, the urban sociologist, she's written about this. In fact, that slums that happen to be on the edge of wetlands, and often, of course, that's where the slums are, because those are the only lands they find to build homes. They also get chucked out. So while the area has been ecologically restored in some way, that's happened with a social cost. The other part of this is that it's tricky to restore a wetland, because it also means dealing with the question of drainage. It's nice to have a tank in Bangalore where you planted, appropriate native vegetation where people can use the area for recreation. But for that tank to actually work in an, ecosystemic way, you have to restore its drainage. And that in a built environment is often really hard. So those are the kinds of dilemmas which I think are difficult to negotiate, given the kind of limited mobilizations that we have seen on the question of the environment, and the much and even smaller mobilization we've seen on the question of bringing the question of social and ecological justice together. But I see that the kinds of crises that cities are going to be facing, coastal cities, other cities, because of climate change, um, I think these crises have to precipitate some kind of social action. and whether that action is going to be actually short-sighted from the ecological point of view or socially even more unequal, um, is stuff that will have to be watched out for and negotiated. So I think the climate change challenge for cities is uh, both something which is going to throw up huge new and we know the way in which these systems work. You have a heat wave. um, we know that the heat wave is much worse for poorer people because all the rich people are inside their air conditioned homes and air conditioned cars, and their exhaust heat is actually making life worse for everybody else out in the street. So there's a way in which elite escape or elite strategies for dealing with climate change can end up exacerbating conditions for poorer people. But the more one can you know help to work against this, the more one should have a campaign, for instance, for sustainable architecture, which reduces the need for refrigeration technologies like air conditioning. The way in which we need to think about urban heat island effects because of the built environment being full of concrete, glass, etc., or because of being covered up by tarmac. So I think these are sort of larger ways of thinking about climate change in terms of urban effects, in terms of different social classes and how they will be differentially affected. I tend to go on really long, right? When
I think because these are very complex questions, and there's something that you said that really stood out, and that I don't think can be emphasized enough in terms of how we think about planning in India, because this isn't how we think about, is that planning is a form of political negotiation, and it's something that happens constantly. It really, the plan should not be the center of it. It's these kinds of multiple actions happening at multiple scales. And I think that's something that we as planners and practitioners kind of need to get our heads around it, and stop putting all of our attention on to how we improve master plans, but really think of how we intervene in all these multiple sorts of processes that happen. A lot of people have said that it's a wicked problem, and one of the advantages of a wicked problem, again, is that there are multiple points of intervention. So I will quickly, so we can wrap up in the next 10 minutes. I'll just read out two of the questions. They're quite distinct, so I think you'll remember them, and then we can wrap up. Sorry, where is it? The first question is from Vidyasagar Pancholi, and he thanks you for your fascinating presentation, and he asks about your opinion on the ongoing regularization of informal settlements in Delhi, and how this sits with your main argument about environmentalism being used as a means of social and spatial order in the city, and hence the series of slum demolitions. So I guess where this fits into that argument, the process of regularization. And then the second question is from Bodhisattva Sen Roy. And he says, as cities grow, they absorb the habitat around it, resulting in wetlands being destroyed, killing not only resident species, but migratory ones like birds. And he's also experienced a lot of apathy and hatred towards cats, dogs, other animals. And animal activists have been hassled and even assaulted by RWA members by speaking up for animals. So how do we build empathy and promote coexistence with animals in our changing urban landscape? And sorry, one more question, if you're able to take it as well. You talk about residential and social segregation, this from Deepthi Raj, between well-to-do and poor neighborhoods. And she's asking about does this also exist within slums and poor neighborhoods? And what are the axes of this segregation and its impact? So kind of, I guess, segregation within poor communities, not just across class. Thank you. So that's quite a lot. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to take more. And we may not. We have about 10 minutes, so I think you can choose which ones to answer.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for these questions. They're all really sort of good, strong things. but I'll try and be brief because I know it's late in the evening. Um, to Vidyasagar Pancholi's question about why slum regularization um, right now, um, I just want to say that what I describe isn't a linear process. I've described in my book how there were earlier moments which were politically much more accommodating of slum dwellers, their homes, their aspirations. So, for instance, a lot of older slum dwellers in Delhi remember the time when they say, VP Sarkar, VP Singh ki Sarkar thi. That particular moment, that brief window when VP Singh's government was in power, was a time when they all received, their homes were surveyed and they were given these tokens, which in some ways guaranteed them the right to not be evicted. And so we find that there are these particular moments, like, say, the emergency, when there's mass evictions, moments when, in the earlier days of economic liberalization, when again there were mass evictions. These, a lot of the politics in Delhi, in terms of different political parties, has depended on the ways in which they relate electorally with these particular constituency. I think at the moment, what we see is a kind of a stalemate because this talk about the regularization of what are called unauthorized colonies. Unauthorized colonies, technically don't happen to be on public lands. They happen to be on land which has been acquired, which has been notified for acquisition by the Delhi Development Authority. So, and has instead been sold by individuals to other people to build homes on, etc. So that's different from squatter settlements, which are on public lands. So this question of the ongoing regularization of informal settlements of unauthorized settlements in Delhi has been ongoing for at least 30, 40 years. And it involves a lot of difficult issues, but I think most political parties, while promising regularization, don't want to give it, because then they lose control over this very large section of the city. Meanwhile, what it is interesting is that while the AAP government has been in power, um, they, because of their populist politics, and because their constituencies lie with the lower middle class and the working class populations, have actually stayed the demolition of squatter settlements. So, for the most part, nobody has been given better housing. They haven't been moved to the legal, affordable housing that they should be entitled to if you had a halfway progressive government. But at least they haven't been kicked out, as happened during previous regimes. So I think that while with liberalization we've seen certain kind of changes, one must also acknowledge the ways in which certain political parties and those who support them and bring them to power are able to negotiate, therefore, a kind of reprieve in certain circumstances. The second question of that Bodhisattva Sen Roy asked about coexisting with other living beings. Um, I absolutely agree with you that there is one, people just don't even know about the way in which the city environment actually allows so many creatures to flourish. I think of the way in which Delhi has more than 120 bird species, because it has such a diverse set of ecosystems: the ridge, the river, the cultivated gardens, and so on. um, but the question really is, and this is always the question of urban order: which species do we want and how many? So, as I show in the book, people don't want cows in the city. They don't want pigs in the city. They don't want mosquitoes in the city. Uh, now, of course, we also don't want pigeons in the city or rhesus macaques in the city. So, this question of coexistence is a complicated one, because we need to actually break it down beyond a sort of more generalized sense of do people respect other living beings, to what particular species are we willing to live with, to tolerate, to encourage. And in some ways, the question that you asked about dogs is a particular flashpoint, because we do see the ways in which street dogs have so successfully carved out an ecological niche for themselves, which includes not only open garbage dumps, but the fact that as a companion species, dogs have managed to persuade people in particular markets or particular neighborhoods to feel good about looking after them. At the same time, however, the situation is one which results in, dog shit lying around. People sometimes get bitten. People are scared of dogs for legitimate reasons. And, therefore, that debate about how you should deal with street dogs is such a vexed one, because the scale on which we're trying to control their numbers is nowhere near what we need if we actually want to gradually move towards fewer dogs on the street. Um, but when we say build up empathy, we really have to say, well, what are the species we want to empathize with? Because, so many species are ones that we don't want, right? Mosquitoes, the COVID-19 virus, etc. Sorry, I'm being a bit flippant here, so I'll stop with that. Finally, Deepti Raj's question about the kind of social economic inequality that exists in slums and poor neighborhoods. Yeah, absolutely. But I don't see necessarily forms of segregation there, Deepti, in poorer neighborhoods. At least in none of the bastis where I have done research, do I see people, sort of keeping their distance from somebody or the other on the basis of, say, caste or religion. Because very often within bastis, what you find are people tend to cluster together with people that they identify as, their own kind. So there is a kind of spatial pattern that emerges within informal settlements as people strive to be with those others with whom they feel, more culturally familiar, as well as more secure from the point of view of safety.
Thank you so much, Amita. These were great questions and very thoughtful answers. We're going to have to wrap up now, though there are still questions there. I hope we continue to interact. I think some of my colleagues would like to talk to you, about your work on heat and pollution and things. We have a water team as well that may reach out. Thank you again for a wonderful talk, and for the audience as well for your great questions. And hope to see you all in the next book talk. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thanks for those questions. And there's several here that are really great, and I wish we had the time to talk.
Yeah. Maybe we can have
Thanks so much for. Yes, but thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Shahana and Madhu. And thanks the audience for being so patient.
Thank you very much. We missed our discussion on the valley of the river last time, but good to catch up.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say, Madhu, we were supposed to be meeting in Bhopal, and